of that said, a number of us, as you can see, we're all working out of home offices. A number of us probably might have other people in our homes that we're not normally used to. And also a number of us are not normally used to working at home, so we might be having a few technical things going on. So I ask you to try to be patient with us a little bit, through all of this. With all that said, thank you and welcome everyone to today's virtual webinar. We have 3 days of content here that we'll walk through just very briefly here in a second. Before we get started, I wanted to kind of share a few logistical pieces here. One is you'll notice there is a Q&A box. If you see a black box either at the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen, if you click Q&A, that is an area where you can ask us questions throughout the webinar, so you don't have to wait till any particular point within the webinar. You can ask it at any time, and this is whether it's a question for the current presenter or if it's some sort of other technical or logistical question. Feel free to use that as a channel as well. For all of the questions for the presenters, we're going to hold those to the end of each presenter's time, and we have Moya and Chris who are working here in the background here to keep all of our logistics up and going. They'll be helping relay some of those questions to the presenters. So those are sort of the big things from that perspective. Let's dig into what today's agenda looks like. So today's day one agenda, I'm going to kick off, just talking about Egeria's an open source project. And then we'll have Fair Cheapers, who's working on getting reconnected, who'll be kind of talking about the Egeria journey so far within ING and Design Lineage. And then we'll have just a broad Q&A at the end of the day. I want to take a moment here and maybe also let just kind of all of the panelists across all of the days, many of them are on the phone call today, and give them all a chance to introduce themselves. So maybe we can just start at the top with Fair.
Sure, you can hear me again?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. So Fred Schepers, Chief Information Architect at ING, also Chief Architect for any global function at ING. I've been working since day one in the space of open metadata.
Great, thank you. I see Chris as well.
Chris Riplogel from SAS Institute in USA. I've been working with this project for a couple of years, trying to contribute from the SAS side. Been a pleasure to be a part of the project.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Kong?
Hello, everyone. My name is Kong Chen, and now I'm the product owner of the Open Metadata platform in ING. So we are building a platform based on ODPI Egeria.
Great, thank you. Dimitros?
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Dimitrios Maimaris, information architect at the FERTS team. I'm working on the project more or less 1 year now, and especially for the lineage part, so we'll take more later, I think.
Thank you. I apologize if I pronounced this wrong. Liptro?
Yes, that's correct. Hi, everyone.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Liptro Balashevsky, software engineer, working for also within FERTS team, supporting the engineering challenges we have in regards to open metadata. Yeah, that's it for me. I will talk a bit more about APIs and how we drive them with metadata.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
Mandy?
Hi everybody, Mandy Chessel. I'm an IBM Distinguished Engineer and the project lead for Egeria, and I've been working with Ferd on this since we first thought of the idea.
Great, thank you. Maryna?
Maryna Strelchuk. I'm a maintainer for Egeria. I'm a part of ING, also FERTS team. I'm working as an information architect and working on developing various capabilities of Egeria and Open Metadata.
Great, thank you. And we have Moya.
Hi, I'm Moya Brannan, and I'm an executive application architect at IBM and an Egeria contributor. So I've been working on the project almost a year.
Great.
So I'll be doing Q&A today.
Great. And hiding under the name of ODPI Community is Chris Blum. I know, Chris, you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Blum. Yep. Hi, I'm Chris Blum, and I help out with marketing on this project and everything OPDI. So ODPI, sorry. Yep. Perfect.
Thank you. And I see we've got a few more attendees that have popped in. I think I see 20 in now, so it's a great audience for today. So with that, let's just kind of roll into why Egeria is an open source project. I'm going to try to get my slides to advance. And it's often a very interesting question that, you know, people who may have not been around open source quite a bit, you know, who are new to the space, but maybe very familiar with the data space in a lot of different realms. It's a natural question comes up, you know, why is this as an open source project? You know, why is this the strategy for success around driving, you know, stronger unions between metadata tools out there and kind of solving a lot of these common challenges across organizations? Why isn't this just something a single vendor can accomplish? They're all very valid questions. And, you know, and in my role with the Linux Foundation, I work across a lot of different industries, a lot of different horizontal and vertical spaces. And it's a very common question, like why is open source the golden ticket to solving all of these problems? And the answer is that sometimes it's not always, but it's certainly the catalyst for making the change along those ways. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But I always, when I kind of get into talks like this, I always like to be my history buff a little bit. I find it very fascinating of where we've came from to know where we're going, because it's really hard to, you know, understand of where all of this is coming together at. So I put together a very brief history of metadata, and I emphasize the brief part because we have a lot of great speakers and I don't want to take time away from them. And as I did research on this, it's really interesting because the metadata actually goes quite back to ancient history and back into the times of ancient Egypt with the Library of Alexandria. And if you go back to 280 BC, the concept of how they were able to better understand sort of what's in the library and how to organize it and how to classify it came to them hanging little tags off of each of the scrolls. And that was their way of doing organization. And they actually, you know, used a tagging system way back in those days. And it's kind of interesting to look back of, you know, this has been a challenge for millennia. This isn't something that's just new, came up in the last, you know, couple of decades. And this is where it all kicked off, was them sticking in there. It also roots to a lot of the library system, sort of their historical views of all of this, but it all roots itself way back into here. Now, if we skip forward many centuries to the 1960s, we see this is the first time that the concept of linking metadata with computing systems and computer systems happened. And it happened within this paper driven by David Griffel and Stuart McIntosh at MIT. And they were talking about this project called Admins, you know, which was an internal project they were doing data cataloging and pieces like that. And within there, they described the need not just for metadata, but also sort of a meta language. So here we're talking the first times that we're connecting, having some sort of language and some sort of terminology and vocabulary that can strew across multiple different computing systems. And this is sort of where we see that rooting happen. From there, everything started to blossom, and we saw organizations globally that really, for either their horizontal or vertical needs, they started digging into metadata and building metadata standards. So you had it, you know, for the library systems, you had it for the automotive systems, you had it for different industries. I came across one the other day that talked about a metadata for oral history. So being able to have classifications of how oral history can be recorded, but also searched and indexed and all those pieces. And it really blew. It really, blew up, amazingly well. Now, the interesting challenge here is there was a lot of effort on the standard side. But the challenge, if you talk to anybody who plays in the standard space, it's how do we translate a standard into an implementation? And that often is a very disconnected practice. And because really standards are often, developed by people in theoretical bubbles. They're developed maybe in an academic context. They're, developed in a context of here's where an ideal state world. But I think all of you who are practitioners just in any sort of dimension, whether it be metadata, but just also maybe in your own spaces, that the best plans of mice and men don't always work themselves out. And so there's a natural challenge where as these standards went into implementation, they would fall down and there would be edge cases discovered. There'd be other pieces, and it was hard for those to get to the call. Standard development, rigorous process. It takes years to get through. And at the pace our industry ends up moving, and the pace that organizations are looking to drive, not just metadata standards, but just technology within their companies, there's an impedant mismatch that happens right away. So this is an interesting area where helping connect sort of those implementations back to the standards that are being developed becomes a real critical piece. And those implementations, having the collaboration around those to figure out, what needs done, what is the actual use cases, what are the edge cases, what are the things that we're actually seeing out of the field. That is a domain that open source has actually been very, very good at, because it helps bring the people that are actually wrestling with these problems, that are writing the systems, that are interfacing with the end users, that sometimes are the end users, that are participating in here and actually driving implementation forward, and then using this as a clean way to drive back into the standards. And it's actually interesting, like even if we look at historically with the Linux Foundation, it came together on that same principle. It came together on the principle that standards are very important, along with actual open source and code development. And you can do one without the other, but if you can marry both together and you can have them both exist in a harmonized way, that produces better outcomes. That produces more people working on the technologies, that produces a better downstream product, that produces a faster time to market. And it's actually why, both of those groups, the Free Standards Group and the Open Source Development Labs came together 2 decades ago to form the Linux Foundation, was on this concept that if we pull together standards and development, we can drive much better outcomes. So that's sort of a little bit how we've got to this point. And if we look at sort of the view of the table of where open source starts to thrive, it's an ability to bring all constituents to the table. And, not just from what is my role? Am I a developer? Am I an end user? Am I a practitioner? But also sort of where I might sit in the stack. Am I developing end user facing applications? Am I a vendor looking to sell? Am I a vendor on the backside of stores and how those connect together? Am I an implementer in the middle, right? Open source has that ability, because it's all rooted around technology and the development thereof, that it can actually unify all those pieces and bring much of that to the table. And I think that's a unique, if we're looking at why Egeria being open source, this is the unique value that can be driven. This is sort of the unique value that has, from as I've talked with people in this project, as I've talked with people in the industry, it's been a missing ingredient. And this is a way that we can help drive a lot of this forward. So if we look at why Egeria being open source, is that it's able to marry together the concepts of open metadata and governance together. And it's able to get key vendors on board, such as folks that are presenting on this call today and more. It's helped driving them through a core set of technologies to align pieces of the industry together. And it's able to have open source in the back end that enables everyone to collaborate on it, in the sense that then you drive a standard there, you drive away into something that everybody can work on and collaborate very easily together. So that's sort of my, shtick on there. I'd encourage you to learn a lot more about this topic. You're going to learn a lot more from the speakers today, but if you're very interested in just sort of the roots of open source and the roots of sort of this project, there's a couple of great links on the page here. egeria.odpi.org for Egeria specifically, and odpi.org for some of the ODPI resources. And if you're sort of looking at sort of the larger landscape of standards and open source together to get other comparable things from different industries, we have a lot of projects and efforts at Linux Foundation that you can go check out. So with that, I will pause quickly for any questions. And if there aren't any, I'm happy to turn it over to Ferd to learn about the ING story.
So we've not had any questions during your presentation, John, in the thing, but we have had a really nice comment to sort of say how great it is to actually sort of see people working from home. And I suppose it's quite a nice thing to actually sort of see everybody on the video. And we made a conscious effort so that we could sort of show the contributors and, that we're all sort of carrying on and doing this in addition to sort of whatever our day jobs are, because most of us have got day jobs in addition to sort of contributing to this. So yeah, we're all glad to be sort of doing stuff here.
Definitely,
I'll hand back.
Very thankful.
If anyone does have questions, just at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A thing. And if you click on that, you should be able to type questions in there. You can also type them into the chat window as well. So, put the questions in there as well. Okay, we'll hand over to Ferd, are we?
So let me just try to present, see if that works. 1 second. Nope, that doesn't work. Can you present for me, Maryna?
Yes. Hopefully. And tell me if you see the presentation.
Yep. All right, so it's going to be quite a few times telling me, Maryna, to move to the next slide, like at this moment. If that works. So yeah, so I already mentioned before, Ferd Schepers, Chief Information Architect at ING, also Chief Architect ING Tech Group Services. So all the global applications of ING, I do the architecture for. Well, actually, people who work for me do, and I just manage to keep them busy. Been involved in open metadata since day one, actually even say before day one. And the reason we got involved as ING is that we saw the need for something like this. And I'll just spend some time on the history of all of that and why we actually came to that conclusion. So if we can go forward a little bit, Maryna. Maybe one more. So about, I'd say almost 10 years ago, I think most of you will remember we were in the hype of big data. And at that point in time, anything that I wanted to do, if I mentioned the word big data, I would get all the options to travel and meet vendors and talk about it, because big data apparently was extremely important. But when I talked about governance, people were totally not interested, because the illusion that was created at that point in time was that you have this amazing thing called big data, and it's all about Hadoop. And the answer is you build a huge Hadoop cluster, you throw in all your data, and then the magic happens. And I think many companies went on this journey. You saw companies building this beautiful data lake. They put in a lot of data. They let data scientists work with that data, and a few years later, they came to the conclusion that this may not have been the best idea of all times, because actually technology is not the full answer. And technology without governance definitely is not the answer, because it creates the same mess or maybe even a worse mess as before. Because some of the technologies we used to have in the past before big data actually had at least some concept of understanding what your data was, because at least they had a structure, and they had columns with some names that may give you some idea about what the data was. But when you throw it into a Hadoop a landscape and you put it on HDFS, you lose pretty much all knowledge of the data that you have. So in that landscape, I was given the assignment at ING to do a complete redo of our technology landscape around data. Next slide, please. And we pretty much looked at the landscape that we had, and the picture that you also saw from John's slide a little bit before actually is a real picture from a single finance process in a single country at ING. It is the fast close process in ING Belgium. This is the best that we know. Probably it's somewhat accurate, but I definitely don't want to go to the regulator and explain that every line on this picture is completely true and that I know every bit and byte of data that actually those lines represent, because that's just not the case. We have a very complex landscape. And in the middle of this hype of big data being there, we also saw that on the horizon, there's a lot of regulations coming towards us that we have to be aware of, and that all tell us the same thing. You have to be in control of data. In essence, BCPS 239, GDPR, all of these tell us, you know where your data is, you know where your data comes from, where it goes to. That is what you have to do. That is really the essence of all these different regulations coming at us. So knowing that, and also knowing that, there were already companies out there that were creating their own little data swamp, we made a decision to go for a data lake architecture that is fundamentally different from just being a Hadoop space. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we created this architecture actually together with Mandy, who is also in this call from IBM. And we decided that what we create, we call it the data lake, but it is much more than just a Hadoop space. It actually has a lot of technologies in there. It has relational databases, it has object storage, it also has big data technologies in there. But the essence, and actually the fact that everything we have in our data lake is governed. And of course, we never used the word governance when we talked about this, but at that time, 8, 9, 10 years ago, governance was pretty much, at least at ING, a 4-letter word there, and it was not something you were talking about. But everything in our data lake is managed in our data lake catalog. And our data lake catalog describes all the data in our data lake. It describes what the data means, the declassification of the data, etc. And it also has a full overview of all the transformations that the data goes through, which in essence mean we have full lineage. The reason we did this not alone but together with IBM was actually twofold. For one, IBM is our biggest partner in this space, and there was this question from IBM: can we do a bit more than just have this relationship as a supplier and a consumer of technology? Can we go to a bit of a partnership model? Well, this would be an ideal space to partner in. But actually more important for me, I've been an architect for quite some years. I've built beautiful architectures that looked amazing on the wall, but you can't always implement those architectures because they don't always work. Having a vendor in this space that actually validates whether we design something, we draw something that works, really helps a lot. Because you know that at least there is an implementation possible for all of this, and that we're not just drawing a beautiful picture, but we're actually describing software that could potentially work. We drew the architecture. That was about, I think, 7, 8 years ago. We well, internally took me probably close to a year to explain this, to explain why it was important, why we need something like a catalog, why this is a good idea. Look, I learned a lot during that year. I still have some scars on my back from trying to sell this architecture. But since that time, I got the mandate to do this. I got a team to build it. We built it in ING Germany first. We rolled it out to, well, in principle, all countries of ING. And this is now up and running at ING in every country. And most of our data, at least all the data that goes to our regulators, goes through this. Analytics goes through this. If I now look at the 20 most important projects of ING today, which most of them are regulatory driven, all of them depend on this technology. This is becoming a real, very essential asset to ING. Can we go next slide? So knowing what data we have, knowing where the data comes from, understanding what happens with the data, understanding what happens with analytics, it is really essential to a bank. Well, not just to a bank, but I can definitely tell you within banking, this is the most important thing we do. So there's a lot of regulators, a lot of regulations that tell us you have to know where your data is. You have to know where your data comes from. You have to understand what the data is used for. You have to be able to tell your customers that you make the right decisions. And on the other side, there is more and more people out there, especially in the analytics space, that want to have new technologies. So people want to play with Python. People want to use Kafka for doing streaming. People want to use Apache Flink for doing streaming analytics. But I still have to be in control. I can't just say, well, you know, a little bit of my data in the data lake, that's, well, actually a lot, but only the data in my data lake is good and everything else is something I don't care about. I have to be in control of all data. So a few years ago, maybe let's go to the next slide. We had to focus only on the data lake as such, but you know, we have to be in control of everything we do with data, meaning that actually my data governance has to extend way beyond the scope of my data lake. I have to know of all the different technologies I use around data, what I do with that data, where that data comes from, how it works, the lineage and everything. Next one, please. So I need to be able to have a landscape where all these different technologies that I work with, because we have a very heterogeneous landscape, and I guess most of you will be in the same situation. I have to be able to understand it across this landscape. And that actually today does not work. I mean, if I have my Oracle products, which we use quite a few of them in the financial space mostly, they have a form of lineage, they have some metadata management, all these stuff exists, but I can't share that with what I do in the data lake, which is based on IBM technology. When I have SAS for my credit risk space, where I use a lot of SAS technology to do modeling, etc. Yes, of course, it has metadata, it has lineage, all these things, but it doesn't really work together with what I have in my other landscape. A lot of these open source products, they don't have any metadata whatsoever. So that's a big gap. I have multiple standards around business intelligence in the bank, but all of them actually have their own little metadata layer where they put some semantic definitions on top of the data. But that's very strange because I already did that in my governance catalog of IBM. Why can't I share that with all the others? So that is how we actually started to talk about, wouldn't it be wonderful if we have this standard of exchanging metadata between those different technologies in such a way that actually I understand across technologies where my data is, what my data means, how my data moves from A to B, without one of those technologies trying to be the master. Because that is the answer that I get from almost every vendor out there. Yes, of course, we are open, meaning you can put somebody else's metadata in my repository. But nobody says, and I'm also very happy to share my metadata with others. It's always a one-way street. And that's where the whole technology around bridges between the different vendors comes from. Everybody is sort of open to consume metadata from others, but nobody is willing to share. Yeah. Let's go to the next one. And this becomes even more important to us when we move to the cloud, because all of a sudden, I'm having to move my whole data landscape to the cloud, and I also have to bring my data governance to the cloud. And the whole idea of moving to cloud is that you use as much as possible what comes with the cloud, and that's where the whole velocity gains, etc., come from. But hardly any cloud vendor out there really thought about data governance and how to connect that to the data that's on-prem. Because all of a sudden I put my data in the cloud and it's an object storage. And how do I manage it there? And it's using the native analytical tools that come with the cloud. But it doesn't really come with a lot of governance. So the combination of having multiple technologies on-prem and also moving to the cloud really led us to understand that if we want to manage this across those technologies, we can't depend on individual bridging of technology, etc. We have to have a fundamental different way of doing this. And that's why we actually reached out to IBM and to Hortonworks at that time, now Cloudera, to talk about, wouldn't it be wonderful in this space, we can work together in creating an open standard around metadata. Next one. So today's reality, we have a lot of solutions in the bank. They have all a form of metadata, and none of them actually talk to each other. So I have my IBM tools, and I have wonderful metadata for my data lake landscape, which is based on IBM. And I have my SAS tools, and I have good metadata there. And I have my other tools in the bank, but all of them are separate when it comes to metadata. Now, Maryna can go to the next slide, then I had to wait until she came back. This is what we really want to have. So we want to have a way to actually federate all that metadata across that heterogeneous landscape without actually telling all those vendors that they have to step away from what they have today. So if I were to go to, say, IBM or Microsoft or SAS or whoever, and I told them, you know, guess what? You have to give up your existing technology landscape and you have to change to something completely new, and your metadata repository is no longer relevant. Nobody would want to talk to me. What has worked is telling all of them, we believe in your metadata repository. There's definitely in your data landscape, you need to have your metadata repository, but wouldn't it be good if all of them can talk to each other on the level of peers? So rather than one of them being the master and all the other ones feeling a little bit left out and a little bit inferior to the master, we came up with a concept of metadata repositories to be on the same level and exchanging data, or metadata in this case, between themselves. And that is very nicely reflected in the next slide, where we actually explain what the concept of open metadata is. So it actually comes with two layers. The first fundamental layer is what we call the open metadata repository services. It is, in essence, a way of different metadata repositories to talk to each other. How do they talk to each other? Well, first of all, they need to understand each other. So we need to agree on a standard of metadata exchange. So what we did is we looked at the full landscape out there of metadata, and we started standardizing the way we can describe the metadata. And we've come up with roughly 400 metadata types that we have introduced as a standard to exchange metadata. Now, that exchange can actually take place in two fundamentally different ways. One is by querying the different metadata repositories and getting an answer through APIs. I always like to compare it with, you know, how you, before Corona, booked a ticket to go on a holiday. You do a query, I want to fly from Amsterdam to New York. And that query would actually go to, I don't know even how many, but many different airline companies that all have the same exchange format in place, how they can be queried, even though internally all those different repository works fundamentally different. And you would get an answer back from all of them, and you represent that answer back to the person who asked the question. Federated query. What also is very important in different use cases is that those metadata repositories can actually update each other and can tell each other that something is happening. A good example of that would be if, for example, a change is made to, let's say, a repository in my data lake. If somebody adds a table there and puts in data, I don't want that to be something I find out when I do a query that says, can you tell me, is there new data? No, I want to get an alert, an event, the moment somebody puts new data in my data lake, because that should actually go to the repository that manages this. And that would actually lead to probably a case and a case management system for a CDO or a data steward to look at this new created data assets. And maybe even before we do like an auto profiling of the data, we run some discovering tool on it and to say, well, it looks like customer data. Should this be routed to the data steward for customer data? Because I want to be aware of these things now. I really want to be able to act on those changes in near real time, rather than waiting for somebody to query what is happening. On top of that, we have the Open Metadata access services, which are fundamentally the way to access metadata for different use cases. So you can imagine a CDO wanting to have a different view on metadata than, for example, somebody who does analytics. A CDO wants to see how many new data elements are there, how much of my data is mapped, how much of the data in the bank is actually available in my governed landscape, how many business terms do I have, how many high-level secure assets do I have, all these things. Whereas an analytics person is fundamentally looking for where can I find good customer data, all these kinds of things. So they have a totally different interface. With a different interface also come different services to access metadata. But they're all on top of those Open Metadata repository services that are the fundamental way to describe metadata and that make it possible for all those different tools to go to this whole federated landscape without knowing which actually are the different metadata repositories underneath. So it's a total decoupling between those two layers. Next slide, please. So to make sure you all understand this is not just an idea and something that we want to do. No, we've actually built it. So as John already said before, the project is called Egeria. It's part of ODPI. We now have version 1.4 out, something like that. I'm not sure actually which version is now out. But I tell you, at ING, we are putting this in production as we speak. So I'd like to already tell you that we have it up and running and that everything is honky-dory, but it will take us a little bit more time. But this is software that is working. We have working connections with the IGC, the Information Governance Catalog of IBM. We have that with SAS, which hopefully Chris will tell a little bit about more going forward. We have an integration with Apache Atlas. We still have to do a few updates there, but it's pretty much there. We've done some other proof of concepts, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But this is working software. And this has been, I think, a journey for now like 2.5 years on building this, with quite some effort from our side, with IBM involved, SAS involved, Cloudera involved. So this is not just an idea. We've actually matured way beyond that. Next slide, please. So one of the important use cases that we see within ING for this is actually that we want to be able to access data independent of where that data is stored, in which repository or in which format, but by understanding what the data means and who can have access to what type of data. And for that to work, what we actually need to do is we need to label the data, which in essence means a mapping between a business term and a physical asset. And by knowing what the data actually is and the classification of that data, whether that data is something anybody should be able to see, or whether it's sensitive or classified data, and by knowing the role that you have, we are able to make sure that only the person who has access to this data will actually see that data in the full sense, and people who should not have access to certain sensitive data, they will only see that data that they are allowed to see, but not this sensitive data. And if we can go to the next slide. And this is something we are building, or actually already have working as a proof of concept or an MVP at ING. Through a data virtualization layer, which sits on top of our data lake, making it possible for all the data that we've labeled in the data lake, which has been classified with business terms and confidentiality ratings, etc., and which has also a way for our data owners to say who can have actually access to the data, not based on in which system that data sits or which data mart that data sits or which physical repository. No, by saying who can have access to confidential customer data. That way, through our data virtualization layer, we are able to make sure that people who access our data lake can only see the data they are allowed to see. Whether that data sits in an Oracle database, a DB2 database, on an object storage in HDFS, doesn't matter. Because we know what the data is, because we know what your role is, because over time we even know in which location you sit. I mean, in the past I would have given the example that people working from home should maybe have less access to data. But I think given the current situation, that may not be the best example. But all these things we can take into account when we determine whether you can see certain data. Next slide, please. So one of the other very important things that we see is that it is important to be able to find your data. And I think this is the biggest advantage we see from actually describing our data very well and making sure that people understand what they're looking at. When I talk to data scientists, well, after they stop complaining about the lack of tooling, the biggest complaint they have is, I can't find the right data. And that's actually also the case when people who want to make decisions tell me that it's very hard to make decisions because they don't have all the right data. It's just because they don't know where that data is. Giving them a way to actually query the data or query what data is available through a catalog interface that goes across this entire landscape makes it possible for us to tell them the data is actually in these different repositories. And then maybe, I think there's an animated slide, right, Maryna? Yeah, by making sure that once they find that data, they can actually have access to that data and retrieve that data, again, through the same data virtualization layer. That makes it possible for people to very easily have access to the data that they need to do their work. So for data scientists, for example, to provision that data into their sandbox and start playing with it, or for people who actually have that data accessible through a BI tool or whatever, to have directly access to that data and start doing the reports or the self-service BI access that they need to have to that data. Again, based on their role, based on who they are, where they are, what kind of data it is, etc. They can see all the data, or maybe they can just see a subset of the data. And if they see only a bit of the data and they feel they need to see more data, they can actually raise a request to get access to more data, which then would go to the data owner who can provision that access to them. Can we go to the next one? So another very important use case for us is how do we make sure that when people are consuming data from BI tools, they actually understand what kind of data they're looking at. And in essence, everybody who has a BI tool out there, they've already been trying to solve this, this problem by creating a semantic layer in their BI tool, which is a great idea, weren't it for the fact that we've already done all that work. So we have already labeled all the data. Every data that we have in our organization is known. And now somebody else, maybe with limited knowledge because they're consumers of data, start to label the data again in a different tool. That doesn't make any sense. So what we did together with IBM is we worked on an integration between IBM Cognos and the metadata repository through Open Metadata. So actually we know the semantic definition of data in our BI tool. So rather than having a very cryptic name, which is just kind of like the name that came from the column or the database to see in Cognos, and have somebody in Cognos say, well, you know, probably this is, I don't know, customer data. or this is a salary or whatever it is, we can get direct access to that data, the way it is described in a data lake repository, the way it is labeled in our catalog, and everybody will have the same definition of that data, which also means they will have not just the name, but they also have kind of like access to things like the full description, maybe even the data quality over time, which we don't have at this moment. But for a person consuming data, it's very important for them to have as much as possible access to that metadata from the technology they're working with. So not just to see the name, but even what other people said about that data. Hey, this is great data, but maybe it doesn't have enough rows, or this data is not very good because actually there is, I don't know, not all the people from every country are in there, or it's limited to this and this kind of columns. Would be much better if this and this would be in there. Same as when I, for example, book a hotel. I keep coming back to these kind of things I can't do anymore, like booking a hotel and flying. I hear myself saying that. But if I'm booking a hotel, the first thing I do is look on TripAdvisor, because I actually trust what other people say about the hotel more than I just trust the star rating that they get officially. Same thing you should have around data. You should be able to actually set your comments on data, the quality, the consumability, whatever it is, and for other people, when they consume that data, to see that and be able to use it. But maybe next one, we didn't only do that with IBM Cognos. Actually, in a collaboration with Microsoft, we made it possible to also integrate Microsoft Power BI with our Open Metadata landscape. And literally, we did this with 2 people from Microsoft and 2 people from our side in 3 days. We managed to get a full integration between Power BI and Open Metadata, so that all the labels we set in IGC are completely visible within Power BI, and people can now consume this directly without somebody creating that layer on top of it, which really shows that our level of abstracting metadata in Open Metadata really works. It was simple enough, everybody to consume. It was simple enough to map to what Microsoft has as an internal model. So pretty much we were very solid on the model. Next one, please. So this is really a very, very important use case for every bank. And this is pretty much how I sold the data lake many, many years ago. It gives me full lineage. Because lineage is pretty much the, you know, the golden bullet, not just a silver bullet, but it's the thing that convinces people that we need to be in control of data. Because every regulator, without exception, is telling me you need to show where your data comes from. You need to show where your data goes through. That's lineage. And we need to have that lineage from system of record to all the stages to where we consume that data, where we send it to the different regulators, etc. So this is our ambition. For the moment, with a single technology in place, I can do that. With multiple technologies, this is a little bit harder. So can we go to the next one? So what we've built, and this is the first use case we're gonna put in production, is a way to actually have the different metadata repositories share their lineage. From Open Metadata, we consume that lineage and we put that in a graph database, which is the Open Lineage Services part of this slide. And on top of that, we build a graph query, which makes it possible for us to visualize lineage across different technologies and optimize that for actually the different queries that we see. So rather than doing a federated query to all the different metadata repositories, which we then have to stitch together on the fly, we actually ask the different metadata repositories to send them metadata through Egeria, which we then stitch together in a graph database. So we have them available for consumption. And when somebody is looking for lineage, we can traverse that full path of lineage very, very fast, because we've already optimized in our graph database for the different queries that we see. Stitching lineage is rather complex. So I think Dimitrios will later on also talk a little bit about it. I don't know whether it's today or not, but this is one of the crux of doing this. I just saw a question coming on, which graph database do we use? At the moment, we use open source Janus Graph in there. But as everything we've built in Egeria is pretty much pluggable, we could over time also put something else underneath. But for now, as everything is open source in this space, we use Janus Graph. And at ING, we do it on top of Cassandra, which is rather performance. But I do have to say lineage queries are kind of like exciting because they have to traverse quite a path, and getting the full path with every potential way lineage can be constructed. It can still be a lot of things you have to resolve. It's quite a challenge. Next one, please. So where are we? Our big ambition is to have the first use cases in production. Well, I would have liked to say like now, but it's going to take us a little bit more time. But we still have the ambition to be in production within the next month or so, or maybe 2 months it's going to be, depending on how working from home impacts us. But in parallel, we're continuing to work with IBM and SAS, and also to improve the versions of Open Metadata. So it's now actually version 1.5 that we're at, but we keep generating new content and new versions every 2 months. But also we're reaching out to different vendors to work together with. So we have already had many conversations with Microsoft, Google, Pega, many other players in this space. We are more than willing to talk to any vendor out there. Personally, I talked to quite a few of them. And as ING, of course, we're focused to a certain extent also on the vendors that we really need to be able to act in this space. So as we move to clouds, we start talking more and more to cloud vendors. As we start looking at different players in this space, especially in the open source community, we also talk to them. Yeah, this keeps being a big attention area for us. We've invested quite a lot in this. I heard John talk before, why is it so important to do this in open source? Well, I can tell you as a company who is not a vendor in this space, this is the way for us to make sure we can get involved. We can actually play quite a role in this. We help set the requirements, we help drive the technology. And as ING, even though we're a bank, I think we are a very big contributor in this space. We have roughly 10 people working on this full time. Everything we do, we put an open source. There is nothing that we don't share. We want this to be successful because I think this is very important to us. Making sure that open metadata is a success is a key requirement for us, because unless this becomes a success, and unless we have something like open metadata, it's going to be near impossible for us in this heterogeneous landscape to actually be in control of data. And putting 10 people to that effort and let them work on that, at the end of the day, is way, way, way cheaper than building bridges between all those different repositories, trying to do this plumbing over the next 20 years ourselves. Because if this is not solved by the industry, there's two outcomes. Either some vendor gets extremely rich on building this integration, or we have to go back to a very homogeneous landscape because we can't afford not to be in control of this space. And we also can't afford, as every company that consumes metadata, to do the plumbing ourselves. Yeah, so we got quite involved. I'd actually hope for many more organizations to get involved. How can you be involved? Well, come up with ideas, help us think about where this could play a role. If you're a bit more, I wouldn't call it mature, but more open to contribute to open source, get involved and have people contribute to this. But even if you just think this is a great idea, talk to your vendors and tell them, hey, we need this, and push your vendors to actually become active in this space and to follow up. Because it is actually us, the consumers of all of this will make this a success or not. If nobody is interested in this, if everybody thinks, yeah, great idea, ING, you just keep pushing, and once this is successful, we'll happily consume. Well, if we're the only ones pushing, it's not going to be a success. But if all of us are pushing, vendors will come on board and they will build this. And of course, it would be great if you would help us test this and validate that we're doing the right thing. But there's many different ways to get involved. And if somebody wants to have a conversation directly with us, not being a vendor and being a player in this space as well, and how to do this, always possible to reach out to us. If you have ideas and questions, etc. I mean, there's a Q&A anyways, but you can also directly reach out to the community. So we're always happy to have conversations with others. And I think I'll leave it at that. I'm pretty much at the end of my allotted time.
Thanks, Ferd. That was really good. Actually, the question that we got was one you were just answering, actually. I had a really interesting question about, the success of Egeria. It's a sort of at a stage now where you're deploying Egeria. And we're at IBM, we've got it sort of going into the applications that we have and some of the offerings that we have as well. And, it's a framework that sort of can be used and sort of implemented. And one that we're growing. So it was really around sort of how are we growing the community, how adoption is going. And I suppose, for us, it's all about sort of increasing that momentum. I'm not sure if you've got any other comments about our community and adoption.
So what I can say is that there's a lot of discussions within the banks in the Netherlands about how to manage data exchange between banks for different purposes. So, for example, we're working on an initiative to do some transaction monitoring, actually forced to us pretty much by the government to do that jointly. And we're very actively pushing open standards like Egeria into that space. So that will definitely drive adoption on our side. I think the moment we are able to show that we can do lineage across multiple technologies and it's working, that will be really the true selling point for all of this. When I talked about lineage 5 years ago, nobody seemed to care. I felt like, am I the only one who thinks this is important? I don't think I get that reaction anymore these days. Everybody now understands that lineage is essential for what we're doing. And everybody has the same challenge. Lineage is spread all over the place. The moment we can show we can do this and we have good performance and we can even at some point in time sign this off with our regulators that they say, yes, this is indeed the evidence we need. That's all the convincing anybody will need.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, we're a fairly vibrant community, the Egeria community. We have sort of multiple webinars each week where we sort of get together, and people can find the details for those on the ODPI website. And I can sort of share those details over the next week. We'll work out the best way to do that, possibly through a blog or something. And also on the last day, on Thursday this week, Mandy will be sort of talking through how to get more involved with Egeria. So we've also had another question, which I'm going to, Mandy, if I'd like you to answer this as well as Ferd. It's an interesting question because we've got metadata management, and someone sort of asked the question, someone called Bruno, about master data, not master data management, but MDM. So, so we've also, there's master data management, there's metadata management. Do you want to just sort of shine a bit of a light on the difference between them two for, I don't know, I think actually we'll leave that one with Mandy to start with, and then Ferd, you could add comments.
So I've just put an answer. So, but it's just fine. I can still talk to it. So yeah, MDM sometimes means metadata management, but typically it means master data management. And master data is the data about your objects, your customers, your products, your accounts, and things like that. And there's a very mature industry around how you deal with that type of data. And so there's two parts to this answer. One is an MDM system, which is typically a hub with flows between all the different systems that hold that type of data, can be incorporated in Egeria metadata. That's absolutely no problem. But the other thing is that actually what Egeria is doing is it's an MDM system in its own right, in that the assets that we're describing are master data. So you'll see that we have support for asset deduplication. At the moment, it's just detecting and creating a report on all the duplicates, but over time we will provide support for creating a sort of golden record effectively, and allowing us to monitor the divergence of the different duplicates. The other thing we do is that because we're supporting collaboration, we support an integration with an MDM hub or a system that supports people that profile information of employees. We are a downstream receiver of that metadata to populate our profiles that are related to collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Ferd, have you any comments you want to add?
No, I could never put it as nicely as Mandy just did. No, but I completely agree. In essence, what we're creating here is master metadata. Is a way for those disparate metadata repositories to talk to each other, to agree on what's there. And for example, if multiple repositories actually identify the same physical asset in the organization, we need to find a way to map those to each other. And that is actually a master data management challenge, where also probably you would get customer data from multiple sources, and you need to find out that these are actually the same, the same customers. So in essence, we're doing a collaborative master data management solution here for metadata.
Okay, and then I know we had a question about how is the master data managed, but was the metadata primarily sort of that we're managing, but also looking at master data. But tomorrow, I think we're going to probably get a little bit more technical, because we've got Mandy talking tomorrow about Egeria as well, and we've also got Chris Rapogel from SAS talking about what they're doing with Egeria. So we'll probably delve down a bit more into the sort of the technology behind it as well. So that'll be good. We did have one other question about monitoring. I noticed, Mandy, you added an answer for that. I don't know if you just want to go over that so everyone can hear that.
Sure. So it was a specific question about whether it's possible to use Embari to monitor Egeria. So Egeria itself is a Java web application that hosts all our services and the connectors to things like Kafka. So I believe Embari is a very extensible environment, so it's possible to build that integration, but we don't have any plans in the Egeria community to build that integration ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But happy for people to contribute and build this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We're willing recipients of such a contribution, but it's not something that we have on our list at the moment, on our backlog.
Mm-hmm. And we have got quite a list of things if people want to have a look at what we're planning for the future. We've got quite a considerable list in our release schedule of things that we're going to be working on over the next probably year, and things that we've already released and worked on. And over the past couple of years, we've done quite a number of collaborations with open source communities, sort of looking at security, looking at data virtualization, which have been quite interesting, and you'll be able to find those and details of them on the ODPI and the Egeria website, as we've sort of blogged about them and things like this. But there are other areas of interest, join the community, get involved, and we can sort of explore those as well. Further, any more comments, or shall we move on to Lineage?
Let's move on.
Okay, so we've got Dimi and Demetrius, and also Maryna. Maryna, are you taking part in this part, or?
Only needed for the questions. Dimi will sorry.
Dimi, you need to come off mute, and we'll hand over to you now.
Yes, let me share the screen as well. So hello from my side as well. Fred explained a lot of Lineage, so I'll be quite brief and try to discuss more the bit points. The slides are more or less the same, so let's go through it. So I'm Dimitrios, I'm an information architect at ING. I'm mostly involved, I'm of course a maintainer on ODPI Egeria, and I'm mainly involved with designing and development of Lineage and how I would like to have it in the community. first thing I want to say, like Fred said, we're a bank. It's really important for our regulators, for people, for everybody to know where data are, how data are. And of course, I think everybody in their company can recognize this picture because more or less it's happening everywhere. So people are getting data and they don't care where they're coming from. They don't care about quality. They don't care about anything. So we as ING, as Fred already mentioned, we said we're really caring about lineage. So we need to go like a first use case to showcase Egeria. And let's do it for the lineage use case, because as you saw, Egeria has many use cases you can use it for. And we decided that lineage for us at the moment is the most important. So we decided to go with that for our first live deployment. So we'd really like to know, as already has been explained, that we have reports in different tools and nobody knows the quality of the data and where they actually came from. So what's the system of record that had this data? So where the data can be corrupted all the way. So ECB wants to know those kind of things. So we said, let's start working on it. So within the lineage part, we have defined 4 different spaces: design lineage, operational lineage, business lineage, and historical lineage. So since the use cases are quite big, we decided to scope it down for the first use case and said, let's go only for design, but let me just explain a bit what we mean by this. So design lineage, when we say, we mean how the jobs are designed to run. So it's the design time and how everything should run. So that's what we're focusing on the first time, and that will be the example I will showcase on the demo a bit later. So then we have operational lineage, which means what actually happened. So what happened when we had a hit run on the jobs, or they automatically run, and we have to compare what actually happened between what actually was supposed to happen. On top, we have business lineage. So most of the users and business users within companies, they really don't care about, they don't know about the technical assets, the technical columns, or how tables are. So they only know about business terms, and they want to, for example, know, okay, let's see where this first name came from. Where is it? I don't want to know. So we said, we'll have a view about business lineage only, that will help business users see how glossary terms and business terms are attached to it, and have a view how this went over the data flow. And the historical lineage, of course, it has to do with all 3 of them. So we need to know at specific point of times what happened. So we can say the last year I went from 1st of March till 25 of April to see for this specific type of term, or for this specific column, how it changed over time. So that are the views that we want to create. At the moment, we're working on the first use case, and the rest will come in the future. So you have seen this picture before. So we say, okay, we need to have so many tools in ING. We need to find a way. So we decided to use Egeria for this, and bring all the tools together, and try to have lineage with all repositories and all systems we and have a unified view, and have only a tool on top to show the lineage to people and to the users. So this is actually what's happening. This is more or less the components and the flow we have for lineage. So in our case, we have a data processing engine, which is a data stage, and it's sitting alongside with IBM information catalog that we have all the metadata. And this automatically, when we have a creation of a job or an update of a job, automatically should publish out events on a Kafka topic. And that will reach the Egeria cohort. So Egeria cohort is an idea like thinking like a group. So all the systems who want to exchange and have an idea of the metadata should be configured to that specific cohort. And all we have a specific topic for that cohort, so everybody can hear and pick up events. And in our case, the second layer, like Fred explained before, we have the Open Metadata access services, where we have specific services for lineage, for example. So these services that are listening to lineage are picking up real-time the events that are published on Kafka, getting the relevant information, as I will show later in the demo, and publishing out another event, which is picked up by Open Lineage services, and it's stored there. So that's the view we want to have. Stitched there all the lineage across all systems. And then on top, we have a UI that will query that graph database and have a view for the business users. So what I want to mention here is that we have 2 ways to communicate with Egeria. One way is like data engine itself can be automatically publish events to the cohort topic. And the second way, you can also directly call an Open Metadata access service that is responsible for that. So you can directly do post calls, REST calls to create your metadata, and that will be saved in a repository you want to. Based on the question also that popped up before, on the moment we're using Janus Graph for the Open Lineage services, but the Egeria itself, it's built in that way that you can exchange your components. So if you have a different database on your environment, you can directly switch to your environment, and the functionality should remain the same. So there's no issue with that at all. So let's now see a small demo I have showing the functionality we already have. It's purely for demo purposes. So within the community, we created let's say a company, we call it Coco Pharmaceuticals, and we created different assets and jobs within it, so we can showcase and test and see the functionality. So for example, here you see on AGC, we have different databases. So for example, now we have an employee table that has different columns, and you can see that it has assigned terms to it. You can see we have a lot of databases. So this is employee. We have a location database that will contain work location table. So the tables that are shown now are being used for a job that we will showcase. So we have two tables here, and we'll have another one, employee salary analysis, which is actually the combination of the two tables, employee and work location. So we also stored some jobs on this company we built. So for example, we have a high-level job called initial load, which contains 3 different jobs inside. So there are 2 jobs that are transforming a CSV to a table, and then those 2 tables are being joined together, and we're creating a new table. So it's just simple just to showcase how it should be done. So for example, you see here, we have file to work location job. So we will dip into it, and we will see that file to employee. It's actually a transformation from a CSV to a table, and then we join that with the other one, and we go to another table. So for example, we can pick on IGC 2 different columns to see, in that case, F name and last name, and you see that it goes through this job, then it becomes this table with the columns having this name, and then it goes through the third job, and the end result seems in the third table. So this is the Egeria UI. We have, it's pretty under development right now. So since we know the column name, we can search for it, and we say we want to see F name. So you see a lot of tabular columns. Here you can see all the types, open metadata types that Egeria support, and you can search only for a specific type if you want to, so you can narrow down your search. The list is quite extensive, so we support different types. And since we know the F name, we can search for it. So in order for Egeria now to know, so what the query you just saw is directly happening from Egeria to IGC. So it's real time, and it's a federated query that's happening behind, and it can query directly IGC and see the name of IGC. If you had more repositories with the same name, then it will query also that one. In that case, it was only IGC behind. So in order for us to be able to search for something in lineage, as we explained here in this slide, we need to store it in this side of the picture. So in order to do that, when something is happening on the data engine you have, it should trigger either an event or, as we said, the REST call, and automatically, more or less in real time, publish out an event here that will be picked up by a specific access service and push it down the line in order to store it. So for example, I will show here how this will look like. So in the meantime, let's see, also we have glossary terms. Yes, we can search for a specific glossary term also. In that case, it's first name. So you can see that we have first name as it's an assigned business term. But in order to look the lineage for that business term, events has to be populated and it's stored. So I will showcase when something happened on data engine, we have data states, it automatically triggers some events on the cohort who I just said. So eventually events will start flowing automatically without any human intervention. And these events will be picked up by specific access service that listens for specific types for lineage. So you can see the events start flowing in a bit, and that's how we start storing it and keeping track of it. So this is the cohort topic that everybody on the cohort listens to. And if you are willing to listen to the specific event, then you can process it and do something with it. And then this will go through an access service called asset lineage homage that is specific for lineage. And this will publish out another event, as we will see now in the next tab, that is only specific for lineage. So, for example, you can see that we have different events flowing here as well. And you can see that we have new relationship events. So something happened that will create a new relationship between a column and a table, for example, or a new table has been created, or all that has to do with lineage. So since we know now, for example, everything is stored, we can search for it and we can start trying to see the lineage out of it. So let's search for the glossary term. In that case, it's last name. And since it's stored, we should be able to see the lineage out of it. So if we have it, and then we can see lineage. In that case, we will see the glossary lineage, so the business lineage we discussed before. So as you see, last name is being used in that case by 3 different columns in three different tables. So the first one is actually the CSV that started the creation. This is the CSV employee that has a column called L name, and this is the last table that it's the join of the 2 CSVs. And you can see that it's this table that has this column L name, and this is the intermediate table that it's been transformed from the CSV, and all the 3 columns has the same glossary terms. So you can see actually in which technical column it's attached. So since we know the name, for example, now for the column, we can search for the column directly. So in that case, we will search for the column of the final result, the employee salary analysis table. We know that it's a relational column, so we'll search directly for it. And we know the technical name, so we can query it. And as you see, we have 3 results, and we're gonna find the one that we care. So the last table, the employee salary analysis. As you see here, the database is employee salary analysis, and the database table should be employee salary analysis. So we're gonna search the lineage for that specific column. And here we're gonna see the end-to-end lineage actually. So here you see the end-to-end lineage for that specific column we queried. So you see that the glossary terms is that that's the one we searched. And you can see the whole flow. So here it's really simple because we have only 2 jobs in between. So you see that this column with this data so you can see when it created, the time and the name, and which part of which table it is, when it happened. It went through that process, then it became that column, then it went through that process and it became that column, and this is the one we queried for. And for example, also, you can see in cases that this can be really big, you have 50, 60 processes in between, you can see directly which is the source that it came from. So in that case, it's the CSV we started with. And also you can see directly the source and destination, because the jobs you can have within the company can be really big. So you have to find a way to see really fast where it came from and where it ended up. So that's why we have different views here. We're still developing and adding more stuff. We're going to add a lot of things into it. We're trying to put classifications on the UI, and we're extending it. So we're trying to make it more sufficient, I think. I think more or less that is what I had to say regarding lineage. This is what we have. We're developing it. We're trying to enhance it. So please feel free. If you have ideas, share it with us. If you want to join, is also better with us. Try to use it. Try to say if it's nice or what we can enhance or what we would really like to see there. We really like that. So you saw the links, and we really like some feedback and people to join and try to push that forward with us. So don't be afraid and just reach us if you want to ask something, if you want to start using it or whatever. We're in the process in ING to putting that live as soon as we can. So that's our goal, and that's more or less what I had to share with you today. It's just a small demo of what we can do and what's the goal.
Yes, if I may add a quick note, and Dimitrios actually is one of the main people who really worked on first step of storing lineage in Open Lineage services, and the UI that you just saw is yeah, just one very simple way for us to start checking what exactly we can query and show to the users. So you could see this is the first, we'll say, prototype for the lineage. And in future, what we are aiming to see is have an ability to drill into more deep. For example, if you start with tables, to see details on the columns and where these columns come from and what processes are on them, ability to filter on different properties, maybe also location or anything that might be interesting to determine a specific subset of the columns. So there are still quite a lot of work, especially on the UI part, to come. And I think so far quite a colossal part of the work by the team has been done on actually listening to the events that are relevant for lineage, creating the context for the entities, and storing and representing this big lineage graph into the graph repository of open lineage services. And as Dimitrios said, any volunteers to work together and test and give a feedback or suggestion would be very useful for us.
Thank you, Demi and Maryna. That was really useful and great. Actually, if you keep sharing the screen, Demi, that's really quite good, because you can actually see on the screen some of the other things that sort of we're working on, because we've got the Type System Explorer up there, and a couple of other things that are there, which we're not necessarily all going to go into all of them this week. So yeah, we've got the subject areas, Type Explorer, and Ferd mentioned earlier today, there's over 400 different metadata types that we recognize, and that list is growing all the time. I think the most recent ones we added were some blockchain ones. And so we've got Repository Explorer. So the interface is something that we're sort of actively working on. So yes, contributors towards the interface is great. I think one of the things that's really quite interesting is when we've talked with yourselves, Maryna and Dimi and Ferd, is when we've talked about sort of the metadata journey and how metadata can sort of flow through and go to so many locations, and it can have, you know, hundreds of places where an individual item of, you know, the metadata is representing can sort of travel. So understanding things like, you know, the provenance and its journey, the lineage is really quite key for organizations to be able to understand that data, and being able to take into consideration, you know, where the data is transformed. Is this the data in its original format? Is it sort of enriched data? You know, where is it in its life cycle? And then also the real-time ability of Egeria to also be able to push out alerts to people in real time when things change, which is another thing Ferd talked about. We've got 5 minutes, so I'm not sure if we've got any more questions. I don't know, Chris, if you're on the call, is it possible for people to unmute themselves if they want to actually ask a question directly?
We can do that, but I think typing in just keeps it a little easier for us to manage.
Yeah, okay, because it might be a bit slower. So we've got quite a good number of the team on the call. So I know we've had quite a lot of questions about sort of momentum and where we're sort of getting with Egeria. But I think the community, you see, we've only got a handful of the contributors and maintainers, and ING have got quite a fairly big team, as have IBM and SAS, and there's also lots of people who contribute independently as well to Egeria. So, Mandy, do you want to add any closing comments? You'll sort of head up all the development that we're doing on the team.
No, not really. Please come tomorrow, I think, is my major comment. We've got 2 more days to go. We have different people talking about different levels of detail and their experience with Egeria, including a whole series of lightning talks on different topics of interest. So please come tomorrow. Thank you for coming today.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've not. Oh, hang on. We got one more question from Nigel. Yes, actually, that's quite an important one to mention. We do have a Slack discussion area. There's a Slack channel for Egeria, So you're more than welcome to go and join that. And if you're struggling to find it, you know, the easiest way to kind of get hold of us is to go into Google, type in ODPI, so that's ODPI, and Egeria. And if you type in the word blogs as well, or you end up on the ODPI site, you'll find the blogs. And most of the blogs have either got our Twitter details on, or they've got links for how you can get in touch with us, or you can contact us through the website. And also on the GitHub site and the Egeria site, we've got lots of information about how you can get involved in these things. The blogs do have information about how to link and join to the Slack channel if you want to join that. But if you're having any problems, have a look for, I think most of us are on Twitter, so look for us on Twitter and send us a message, and we can sort of add you to the Slack channel if you're struggling to get on there. You can join our calls. I think the public calls Tuesday morning, is it, Mandy? And Thursday afternoon for the ODPI one. Okay.
Both Thursday, sorry. Both Thursday. Couldn't get off mute. Both Thursday morning. One Thursday morning, which is a developer one. This is European time. And the afternoon one is more the broader community, where we do demos and talk about our plans and different sort of, it's more of a design review at that level.
Yes, one thing that someone did also ask just a little while ago was about Python. And one of the things that we've done with Egeria that Mandy and the team have put together, and ING have put together for Lineage, are some Jupyter notebooks. Of course, Jupyter notebooks, and they're using Python in them, which is fairly straightforward to understand. And the beauty of the Jupyter notebooks is we use them to explain how to use and work with Egeria and to show certain concepts. And when you go into the notebook, there's a lot of description about how we've set up the environment. And of course, it's a notebook, you can press play, the notebook will play out, and you will be able to see all the activities happening and what's going on behind the scenes. So you can actually see Egeria working. So there's a blog on the website written by Nigel, and that will actually talk you through how we set up a Docker environment, so you can run it on your laptop if you've got Docker installed, and then have the notebooks up and running within minutes, so you can actually sort of start trying out Egeria and understand some of the concepts that we have. So Dimi mentioned cohorts. There's a big explanation of what a cohort is and how we use them. So tomorrow we've got Mandy from IBM talking, and we've also got Chris Rapogel talking, and they'll be going through more detail of Egeria. And I think at the end of that, Mandy, you're going to do a how to join the Egeria community if people are interested and get started with Egeria. As Mandy said last day, we've got a series of interesting lightning talks on a whole set of subjects that we're working on. So if anyone's not got any last comments, I think we'll close this now and see you all again tomorrow at the same time. Silence. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.